600 years ago, two guys hated each other. But to be more specific, two artists hated each other. To be even more specific, this was during the Renaissance in Florence, so two Florentine Renaissance artists hated each other. And they acted out one of the great rivalries in history. And much like the rivals that you get in a movie like The Prestige, who are magicians and so they attack each other with magic tricks, these two attack each other with art competitions, architecture, elaborate pranks, and sonnets. This is one of the great and yet rarely told stories from Renaissance Italy. And today I'm going to tell you the entire thing. Not just to obsess over the artworks that they created or to wallow in their amusing antics, although we will be doing both of those things. Also because the story tells us something enduring and occasionally endearing and definitely cautionary about artists. So without much further ado, here's the story of the two Renaissance artists who hated each other. But before that, do like and subscribe. Not doing so could be illegal in your state or province. To be safe, I would just go ahead and hit the button. Also, I've been working on an ancient Greek card game. And you can see more about that in the link in the description. Part 1, the competition of 1401. The year is, as you might guess, 1401. We are in Florence, and a committee of the city's merchant guild, which is called the Calimala, stages a competition to create the remaining bronze doors for the octagonal baptistry, which is next to the Florence Duomo, or cathedral. And you've probably seen this cathedral before, but it didn't have the dome yet, or the outer decoration. So this is an artist rendering of what it probably looked like. You know, actually, this is probably going to be a little bit simpler if I give you a lightning-fast history. So,
hold on to your butts.
So Florence hated Siena, which was another city in Tuscany, and Siena built a much nicer cathedral, a zebra-striped cathedral. And you might say, well, the flavor is gone instantly. But the thing is so well made that it retains its delicious tones to this very day. Very jealous the Florentines were. Their main church was called Santa Reparata, and it was little and sad. They had finished this super cool octagonal baptistry that they called San Giovanni back in the 12th century, and now their church just looked unimpressive next to it. Santa Reparata was a little Romanesque church. It was simple and small and brick and didn't have all the flashy zebra stripes of Siena. So the city of Florence wanted to rectify this, so they had an all-star architect brought in, Arnolfo di Cambio. Arnolfo broke ground on the new cathedral somewhere between 1294 and 96, nobody knows for sure, and began a project that they well knew was going to take decades to complete. But don't worry, you can still go to church. The new cathedral was so big that Santa Reparata actually sat inside of the new walls. It was churchception. And the construction was going really well. The people of Florence celebrated.
And there was much rejoicing.
One document even tells us that Florence gave Arnolfo tax-free status for life as a reward for all of his architectural philandering. Because not only was he building the Duomo, but he was at the same time building Palazzo della Signoria, which is the main civic building of Florence. Then he died. Somewhere before 1310, not exactly sure when, kaput, he's dead. Work on the cathedral just stops. So Florence needs a new architect, a new master builder, what they call a capomastro. So they hire Giotto di Bondone, and he is a famous painter who, according to the occasionally accurate historian Giorgio Vasari, who we will be referring to consistently throughout this video, he was so talented as a young apprentice that he painted a fly on his master Cimabue's canvas. And when Cimabue came back, he tried to shoo the fly away. I suppose I'll go off into the other room. I'll probably just stay there a while, not paying attention to my canvas. And that is all it takes to build a massive stone cathedral. So Florence gives Giotto the reins, and he takes one look at the walls with the smaller church sticking out of it, and he promptly begins to build a bell tower instead. It's a freestanding bell tower. It sits next to the church, actually has a gap between the two of them, and it's called a campanile. He gets a little ways into this bell tower, and then he promptly dies. It's the 1330s now, and his assistant, Andrea Pisano, takes charge as the new Capomaestro. And here's where we get to what is undoubtedly an important piece of information. Andrea Pisano is not only helping Giotto work on the Campanile and the Duomo. In the beginning of the 1330s, he also creates bronze doors for the octagonal baptistry of San Giovanni. And I know you're probably thinking, Andrea Pisano dies. And it's hard to tell because everybody dies. In 1348, Black Death sweeps through Florence, and it's hard to know exactly what the death toll was, but it could have been as high as 50% of the population gone. Everything gets pretty quiet in Florence at that time. Construction obviously becomes very slow, and years pass without nearly as many records as we have either before or after that time. The work on the cathedral becomes a crawl, and there's a cycle of new capomaestri during this time. And then we leap forward into the present. And by the present, I mean the past that we were talking about a few minutes ago. It's now 1401 again. And Florence is recovering. And when Italians recover from a disaster like a plague, they seem to respond by building stuff. Building lots of stuff. By 1401, the main body of the cathedral has been completed. Santa Reparata has been demolished. The Campanile is done. In fact, everything's pretty much done on the cathedral, except it has a big giant hole on the top of it. The dome is missing, and yes, it means it just rains down into the church. There simply wasn't a tarp big enough to cover it. But that's a problem for another day and later in this video. What the city of Florence is dealing with right now are the remaining doors of the baptistry of San Giovanni. The baptistry has 3 different entrances, and only one side has the beautiful doors of Andrea Pisano, which were completed more than half a century ago. And so Florence is putting on a competition, and the competition is to find the artist who will complete the other 2 sets of bronze doors. Those on the north side of the baptistry, and then, if everything works out, the big ones, the doors that face the Duomo, otherwise known as the important ones. So Florence sends out a call to all the artists and artisans in the region, and lets them know about the competition, and also that the competition has a fat, juicy prize. Not only do you get the renown for making the doors of this beloved baptistry, which even Dante mentions in his Divine Comedy as my beautiful San Giovanni. But the commission could take up to 10 years to complete, basically a guaranteed decade of well-paid, prestigious artistic work. And now I can finally introduce our characters. Number 1, Lorenzo Ghiberti. Lorenzo was the son of a goldsmith and thought to be born out of wedlock and illegitimate. This could be why he seems to have a bit of a chip on his shoulder, although history does show him to also be very charming. People like the guy. Number 2 is Filippo Brunelleschi. Filippo was the son of a mid-tier public servant, a notary, which I think meant a little bit more back then than it does now. Filippo's name had more cachet in Florence than Lorenzo's did. But he was not raised in an artisan's household like Lorenzo. He showed significant skill as a child, and so his father got him into training and apprenticeship with the appropriate guilds in the city using his connections. And so that's how he learned metalwork and sculpture and painting. And unlike Lorenzo, he seems to be a little bit less sociable and a little more cold and blunt and prone to bouts of rage. In fact, at the time that he probably heard about the call, Filippo was doing metalwork in Pistoia for an altarpiece that really is quite beautiful. Both of the men were very young. Filippo was probably a little bit older, but both of them were between 20 and 25, although there's a chance that Lorenzo could have even been 19. Either way, whippersnappers, the both of them. There were at least 5 other entrants to the competition, at least, but who cares about them? This video is already going to be too long. But this was a competition, and that means you had to make something and then put it before a panel of learned judges. And the judges wanted the competitors to make something very specific. A bronze image of the sacrifice of Isaac. The judges probably chose this one because it's a lot of really difficult imagery to pull together into one composition. They wanted Abraham right on the cusp of sacrificing his son Isaac, when the angel of the Lord emerges from the clouds and stops him. Then it also needs the ram in the thicket, which is going to be the sacrifice that God provides. And then it also needs the servants of Abraham visible and a donkey. All of those separate from the central scene, all on a composition about the size of a pizza box that has to be legible from a distance. They had 1 year to make their submissions, and this is what they made. In Filippo's piece, Abraham has a violent hold on Isaac, and likewise the angel emerges from the cloud and literally grabs his arm in order to stop him from carrying out the sacrifice. The lean of Abraham's body and the flying cloth behind him show a lurch forward with the knife, and the angel creates a direct counterforce to Abraham. This centralizes the action and pulls the eye into the chaos at the midpoint of the composition. To the left of Isaac's strained pose, we see the ram, which is caught in the thicket, and then down below we have the servants of Abraham who are distracted while awaiting the return of their masters. The donkey separates them, and on the right, one of them is bending down in a complex and difficult pose that really shows off Filippo's skill. Then the real hero of the story, the second servant, stares into the pad of his foot, readying to pull out a thorn, or perhaps commencing on a satisfying session of peeling dead skin from his toe. Now see, that's a joke. It's probably a thorn. Giorgio Vasari refers to it as a thorn in his biography of Filippo. But I have noticed that when people argue with you in the comments, it's usually because you didn't say everything possible that could have been said about the thing. So yes, it's probably a thorn. It's a reference to the spinario of ancient Rome, but that's the only time I'm going to add context. Everything else I say is just to incite inflammatory contradiction in the comments. Lorenzo's piece is more fluid and less urgent. Abraham here is not lurching towards Isaac, rather the flip of his sleeve indicate he's pulling his arm back before the strike, rather than in the midst of the strike itself. The angel is emerging from the clouds, but it does not seize his arm, but rather seems to call out to him. The ram is caught in the thicket atop this stone promontory, making him harder to see, which is a bit more narratively logical. The servants are separated by this same formation and unaware of the scene that's unfolding above. The figures are generally more upright, and Lorenzo's compositional intentions are very different from Filippo's. Rather than concentrating the action in the center, we have 4 threads that emerge from the lower right-hand corner like petals from the center of a flower. So these are the 2 submissions of Filippo and Lorenzo. Which do you think should win? Vote now by texting 39420799768201752 But I wouldn't do it, because the number's fake and standard rates will apply. Instead, you could probably put something in the comments as to who you think should have won. But of course, we have to answer that question, who did win? And the answer is a little on the muddy side. Here's what we do know. Lorenzo receives the commission, so he does technically win, but there's some evidence that the judges of the Kalimala could not decide between the 2, and so they offered it to both of them to do as a joint project. And Filippo said no. If he couldn't have it entirely to himself, he refused to do it.
There can be only one.
This was the account that was given by Antonio Manetti, who was a younger friend of Filippo who was writing about this decades after it happened. We can assume he's probably got a little bit of bias on the part of Filippo, but it's also unlikely he's making things up entirely. And there is a bit of credibility here, because bronze is expensive. It usually gets melted down and reused unless it's needed, and this is why marble sculptures tend to survive from the ancient world as opposed to bronze ones. Often they get melted down into spearheads at those moments in history when weapons are a little more highly prized than statues. All the other submissions to the competition are long gone. They were probably melted down in order to use the bronze for the actual project of the doors. But yet, Filippo's survives, even though he did not win the competition nor receive the commission. You can go see both submissions right now in the Bargello Museum in Florence. This is one of the points that's raised by Paul Robert Walker in his book, The Feud That Sparked the Renaissance, which is a very good book on this subject, and you should read it. I'll put a link in the description for you. But not everyone agreed that the Calimala intended to offer it to both Lorenzo and Filippo. In fact, one of those people was Lorenzo himself. He gives a slightly different account of the victory. To me was conceded the palm of victory by all the experts and by all my fellow competitors. Universally, they conceded to me the glory without exception. Everyone felt I had surpassed the others in that time without a single exception, after a great consultation and examination by learned men. That's Lorenzo. Filippo seems to have taken this quite hard. He does not seem to have been a great loser. According to Manetti, and later Giorgio Vasari, Filippo took his friend Donato, better known as the Ninja Turtle Donatello, and went to Rome for a while to join in with this new movement of young Italians that were excavating the ruins and sculptures of ancient Rome to study the masters of that time. And of course, the idea is that Filippo also studied the Pantheon, the largest freestanding dome in the world at that time, to unlock its ancient secrets. Because the Duomo of Florence still had a roofing problem, and solving that problem was on Filippo's mind. Part 2, the competition of 1418. Depending on who you ask, Filippo stayed in Rome for a long time, or came back to Florence soon, or stayed in Rome and visited Florence, or vice versa. No matter what the living arrangement was, he re-engaged with Florentine life, and he put the whole competition of 1401 behind him. Or did he? See, in Renaissance Florence, the television had only recently been invented, and so the available programming was very limited in quality and quantity. It was mostly shows that pretended to be mysterious, until the writers were forced to resolve those mysteries in the most disappointing ways possible. And medical dramas, where every conversation boils down to some form of, I wanted to save that man's life. No, you wanted to advance your career. And the Florentines were just having none of it. So they needed compelling drama in their lives. And watching the shenanigans of the city's artist turned out to be just the thing. Filippo's loss in 1401 was very public. But it wasn't all shame. The people of Florence formed camps of which artists they supported, and the specific qualities of each of these Sacrifice of Isaac panels were hotly debated over the morning brioche. You were either a Filippo guy or a Lorenzo dude, and nary the twain shall meet. A more vociferous tribalism would not be seen until hordes of preteen girls grappled with whether Bella should marry the serial nudist with anger problems or the century-old deceased man. As the years went on, this only increased as Filippo and Lorenzo worked on various projects, crossing paths time and time again as they worked on things in Florence, which in comparison to the cities of today was kind of a small community. Even today, when the streets are very much the same as they were in the 15th century, you can walk all the way across the old city of Florence in maybe a half hour strolling. But then the really big project finally turned up. People had had enough of being rained on during Mass, and it was time to put a dome on the Duomo. The only problem being that no one knew how. After the Black Plague, the original plan for the cathedral that was drawn up by Arnolfo de Cambio was expanded by later architects. As a consequence, the size needed for the dome increased. In fact, the structure as they built it was going to need a dome with a diameter of about 55 meters, which was more than 11 meters wider than the diameter of the Pantheon's dome, which again was the largest in the world at that time. And the Pantheon dome, being made of solid concrete, requires walls that are 20 feet thick just to hold it up. So the new committee, which is referred to as the Opera, brought together all the artisans and engineers and architects of Florence for a little brainstorm session of hearing out the potential solutions to the problem. Not only was there the problem of trying to figure out how to build a dome of that size that didn't collapse in on itself, because it was going to have to be made out of brick as opposed to a single piece of concrete, since nobody is even now completely sure how the Romans did it for the Pantheon. But there was no consensus on how to even get the materials up to the necessary height, which I think is about 175 feet off the ground. As you would expect at a brainstorming session, people were throwing out ideas. One of the ideas that Vasari gives us is the proposition that they should fill the church with dirt mixed with coins. And that way they could make a big hill or a platform where the workmen could reach the necessary height. And then when you're done with it, you just let the people of the city come in and take the dirt, and whatever coins are in the dirt that they take, they get to keep, like a prize in a cereal box that you can use to buy even more brioche. Così tanti cornetti. But Filippo said that all of this was a bunch of bunk. He claimed he could do it without a pile of dirt, and even without nearly as much scaffolding and wood, which was quite expensive, that was being proposed by others in the room. But they laughed at him. They mocked him. And he got flustered and he just kept arguing and he wouldn't shut up about it. And so, as Vasari describes it, having been dismissed several times and finally refusing to go, he was carried away bodily from the audience by their servants, being thought to be wholly mad. So they threw him out. People are afraid of new ideas, whether it's an idea for a dome or my theory that you can eat off the floor if the thing that was dropped was heavy enough to blow the germs away with a gust of air. So if it's a big steak, that's good for way more than 5 seconds. The arguments continued to rage on without resolution, and further debates were held. Filippo returned and he held his ground. He gave specific reasons why this wouldn't work or this wouldn't work, but as far as his own solutions, he played his cards close to the chest. He didn't want to give away his methods. Giorgio Vasari says that Filippo could have shown a little model that he had in his possession, but he did not wish to show it, having recognized the small intelligence of the consuls, the envy of the craftsmen, and the instability of the citizens. So Filippo doesn't give away the specifics, but he does produce an egg, a grade A white large egg. And he uses it to offer a challenge to the others. Whosoever could make an egg stand upright on a flat piece of marble should build the cupola, since thus each man's intellect would be discerned. Taking an egg, therefore, all those masters sought to make it stand upright, but not one could find the way. Whereupon Filippo, being told to make it stand, took it graciously, giving one end of it a blow on the flat piece of marble, made it stand upright. And the craftsmen protested that they could have done the same, but Filippo answered, laughing, I like to use the word cackling, that they could have also raised the cupola if they had seen the model or the design. Okay, I do have to try this. That wasn't hard enough. Ah! Yeah, okay. I'm gonna have to eat that later. By the way, most academics tend to think that that's an apocryphal story about the egg, but that's mostly because academics have a severe allergy to fun. So the opera had heard enough, and they paid for some models to be built, so that the ideas of each person entering into the competition to get the commission to create the dome could prove that they have the best tactic. The stakes were a little higher here than they were with the bronze doors of the baptistry, because not only do you have the expense of construction, which is already much higher than the doors, but it could also fall on everyone and kill them. Of course, Filippo Brunelleschi was one who completed a huge model, I think about an eighth size, out of real brick for what the dome would look like. Also building a model was, of course, Lorenzo Ghiberti, which is a little strange because Lorenzo had no real knowledge or experience with architecture, and that doesn't necessarily preclude you in the Renaissance. They had a sense of, just like with Giotto di Bondone, that if you were a genius in one artistic sense, you could probably do others as well. Filippo, though, had done all kinds of architectural projects since returning from Rome years ago. But Lorenzo also did have the admiration of the opera and of a lot of well-connected people in Florence. He was a people person. Also, his work on the doors of San Giovanni was ongoing. It was taking longer, maybe, than the Calimala had originally intended, but the work he was producing was really superb. They were highly praised, and you can even go see the original doors now in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Florence, as well as replicas that they have in the position of the original doors on the baptistry. They are tremendously beautiful. The work of Ghiberti is incredible. And then you have Filippo and his relationship with the opera and the people of Florence. He was respected because he was very capable, but he was also irritable and secretive. He did show enough of the model, however, that the commission was given to him to create the dome. And so technically he's the winner of the competition of 1418. He was appointed as Capomastro with a salary of 3 florins per month. However, for a reason that is not completely clear, Filippo was assigned, seemingly out of the blue, a co-capomastro, and it was Lorenzo Ghiberti. Nearly 2 decades after Filippo had supposedly turned down a joint commission with Lorenzo, he was now in the exact same situation. And according to Vasari, he didn't take it particularly well. How great were the despair and the bitterness of Filippo on hearing what the wardens had done may be seen from this, that he was minded to fly from Florence. And if it had not been for Donatello and Luca del Robbia, who comforted him, likely with pizza and a Vespa, he would have lost his reason. There's plenty of theorizing to be found as to why Lorenzo was given the same commission, and by the way, the exact same salary of 3 florins per month. Both Vasari and Manetti, who tend to agree with each other because Vasari was pulling from Manetti and using him as a source, that there were some behind-the-scenes machinations going on the part of Lorenzo. But I also think there's a case to be made that just the opera trusted Lorenzo based upon the work that he had already done. And again, you didn't have to be an architect to be seen as a genius who could be capable of carrying out the problems of other media. There was less sense of specialization at the time. And also, Filippo was secretive and disruptive, and he was never described as excessively friendly. There's an entire novella called The Fat Woodworker, where he plays an incredibly elaborate and cruel prank on a man named Manetto, convincing him that he has transformed into someone else and someone else has become him. The guy ends up in prison and leaving the city, and the story paints Filippo as the good guy. And maybe you've heard the phrase that you attract more flies with honey, and I'm not sure why anybody would want to attract flies. But you could assume that this would work in a similar way with people, that if you smear them with honey, that they'll like you. And if you don't have any honey, you could be nice to them like it's some kind of social honey. Either way, the work on the dome commenced, and the 2 capomastri were on the site to guide the builders in finally completing the Grand Cathedral of Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore, St. Mary of Flowers. And while both Filippo and Lorenzo were equally credentialed by the opera, both of them same salary, same title, it was clearly Filippo who was in charge of the work site. He was the only one who understood the program, the meticulous detail of what had to be done from one day to the next. Not only for the creation of the dome itself, but for the machinery and for the infrastructure that was necessary to carry out the construction. Filippo had meticulously planned all of this, and nobody knew what was supposed to happen from one day to the next except him. So it's not really clear what Lorenzo was up to at this time. Granted, he was still working on the bronze door, so he was probably busy for that, but he was definitely at the work site, at least from time to time, possibly even just keeping an eye on Filippo, or maybe just drawing his salary of 3 florins per month, which is certainly how Filippo saw it. And so Filippo devised a scheme, worthy of a Scooby-Doo villain, to prove that he and Lorenzo were anything but equals. And I'm just going to let Vasari tell this part. One morning, Filippo did not appear at the work, but bound up his head and went to bed, and caused plates and cloths to be heated with great solicitude, groaning continually, and pretending to be suffering from colic. The master builders, who were standing waiting for orders as to what they were to do, on hearing this, they asked Lorenzo what they were to go on with, but he replied that it was for Filippo to give orders and that they had to wait for him. And one of them, asking the key question here, said, "What, dost thou not know his mind?" "Yes," answered Lorenzo, "of course, I would do nothing without him. We're like this." And this he said to excuse himself, because not having seen the model of Filippo and having never asked him what method he intended to follow, he would never commit himself in talking of the matter in order to not appear ignorant. There's that chip on the shoulder again. And he would always make a double-edged answer, the more so as he knew that he was employed in the work against the will of Filippo. The illness of the latter having already lasted for more than 2 days, the proveditore, which is kind of like the supervisor, and many of the master masons went to see him and asked him repeatedly to tell them what they were to do. And he replied, "You have Lorenzo. Let him do something." Nor could they get another word out of him. And then the warden of works, seeing themselves disgraced by the state of things, determined to go and find Filippo, and after arriving and sympathizing with him first about his illness, they told him in how great confusion the building stood and what troubles his illness had brought upon them. Whereupon Filippo, speaking with both great heat, both under the cloak of illness and from the love of the work, replied, "Is not Lorenzo there? Can he do nothing?" And then the wardens answered, "He will do naught without thee." And Filippo retorted, "But I could do well without him." It's very subtle. After a few days, Filippo returns to the worksite, and he makes kind of a dramatic show of just how difficult it is for him to walk out of there. Oh. While he was there, he just wondered aloud if what would happen to the work on this dome if sickness were to strike him again, or, heaven forbid, maybe it would strike Lorenzo. So he said it would be wise if they would just split the work 50-50. I mean, they're both capomaestri. They're both master builders according to the will of the opera, or the wardens, as Vasari refers to them in his English translation. In this show of sudden good faith, he offers Lorenzo the choice between 2 tasks that have to be done. One of them is the creation of the scaffolding, which is going to be up high where the workers can move around and, build the basic elements of the dome. The second one is an enormous wooden chain that they're going to need in order to haul things up to the proper height. So this is not some small chain. This is some huge and intimidating piece of industrial equipment. However, Lorenzo, upon hearing this, he knew that he didn't really know anything about scaffolding, and a chain seemed like a simpler prospect, and so he opted to complete the chain as opposed to the scaffolding. However, this was in fact a trap that was laid by Filippo. This was a trap as obvious as trying to catch a murderer with a box and a stick and a sign that says "murderable people" inside. Filippo had already devoted a great deal of time to designing both the scaffolding and the chain. Lorenzo knew nothing about either. So Filippo built the scaffolding with lightning speed, while Lorenzo struggled to direct the workers on how to construct the chain. Apparently it didn't look quite right in the end. Like when you're a kid and it's craft time and you are trying to make a macaroni portrait of your parents, but the further you go into it, the more that it looks like a family of sleep paralysis demons. But you keep making it, because what else are you going to do? Tell the teacher? So the members of the opera, they saw the chain and they didn't think that it looked like it was going to work. And so they asked Filippo to come and take a look at it, and he tissed a few times. It admitted that they were probably going to have to throw it away and start over from scratch. Maybe pretend that the whole thing had never happened. And then he made the chain, according to his pre-existing designs, with great aplomb. This made him seem so impressive to the opera that they awarded him a 100 florin bonus on top of his salary. And his primacy on the project was never questioned again. And as for Lorenzo, Vasari says, finding himself vanquished and, as it were, put to shame, was favored and assisted by his friends so powerfully that he went on drawing a salary. Lorenzo had friends in high places. Part 3. Sonnets and Endings. As I said, Lorenzo had many friends in Florence among scholars and artisans and politicians. He was, again, a charming man. He was well-connected and he was self-made. One of these friends was Giovanni Gherardo di Prato. And Giovanni had many criticisms of Filippo's dome as it began to rise above the streets of Florence. And even though there's no documented connection between Giovanni's criticisms and Lorenzo Ghiberti, it's hard for me personally to believe that in a relatively small city like Florence, that there was no shared animosity to be aired. I believe there might even have been a conspiracy to embarrass Filippo. It's a theory that I have. It's a theory that a conspiracy occurred. It's what some might even call a theory concerning conspiracy. So you know you can trust it. Giovanni attacked Filippo's plans for the dome in the most Renaissance way that someone could, by writing mean sonnets. This is a bit of a historical footnote, but I want to read you some parts of the sonnets as recorded by Paul Robert Walker in his book. You have to remember, too, that in the culture of Renaissance Florence, poems that are written about people like this were passed around like memes. This was as public as publishing something in the newspaper in 1930. Everybody who's anybody saw it. The argument centered around whether or not Filippo's dome would allow enough light into the church. Giovanni insisted that it would be too dark, but if you read just the sonnet, that really doesn't seem to be his focus. O you deep fountain, pit of ignorance, you miserable beast and imbecile. It's very subtle as well. Who thinks uncertain things can be made visible. There is no substance to your alchemy. And that, by the way, is a phrase that I would like to use a lot more in daily conversation. The fickle mob, eternally deceived, in all its hope may still believe in you, but never will you, worthless nobody, make that come true, which is impossible. Then we'll skip ahead just a little bit because, frankly, there's a line in here that is so dramatic that it could get me demonetized. For surely you are mad, you hardly know your own profession. Leave us, please, alone. I love the Renaissance. Then Filippo responds with his own sonnet. And do pay attention here, because the first line will make it sound as though he's taking the high road. And then the second line will take the low road with marvelous enthusiasm. When hope is given us by heaven, O you ridiculous-looking beast, we rise above corruptible matter to gain the strength of clearest sight. Jumping ahead a little bit. For wise men, nothing that exists remain unseen. They do not share the idle dreams of would-be scholars. Only the artist, not the fool, discovers that which nature hides. And this is one of the things that I want to glean from these sonnets, is that in this angry sonnet, this 15th century equivalent to a Twitter fight, Filippo gives us a very clear view of how the Italian Renaissance conceives of the idea of genius and the artist. In order to be a great artisan, artist, scholar, poet, you have to be a genius. And a genius in the Renaissance is a person who is able to see that which others fail to perceive. The genius is the man who sees the hidden things of nature. Art in the Renaissance was so much about perception, the ability to see the hidden things of nature, as Filippo put it. To be able to detect the beauty that exists in the world around you. It's a really interesting conception of the artist, because it views the artist as a worthy vessel who is receiving from an external source. This is actually quite different than many of the conceptions of the artists you see in the 20th and 21st century, where meaning is sort of born from within instead of fed from without. But we will come back to that. Now, this has been a story about rivalry, and unfortunately there's no big moment that finishes it out. There's no climax to the story where there's a clear winner that's offered up. Both men continue creating incredible artwork for the rest of their lives. Filippo dies in 1446, close to the age of 70, and Lorenzo lives almost another decade. He dies in 1455. The doors created by Lorenzo are referred to as the Doors of Paradise. They're among the most beautiful metalwork found in the Renaissance or after. Lorenzo Ghiberti creates other sculptures all over Florence, including St. John the Baptist, St. Stephen, and St. Matthew for the Orsan Michele Church in Florence. He was a highly sought-after and well-regarded artist for the rest of his life. He's buried in the Santa Croce Church, where the mortal remains of Michelangelo, Galileo, and Machiavelli are housed. Filippo Brunelleschi completed the dome that still stands to this day. Even now you can climb to Piazza Michelangelo, which is across the river and just outside the city of Florence, and see the dome rising above the city, forever instantiated in the background of selfies by millions of intoxicated Instagrammers. A statue of Filippo sits alongside one of Arnolfo da Cambio outside the Duomo, representing the geniuses who brought that building into reality. He also designed the San Lorenzo Church of the Medici, the Santo Spirito Church across the Arno, and many other projects of various sizes all over Italy. He's buried in the crypt of Santa Maria del Fiore, a church that he completed with his vision of the dome. I find myself a little bit torn by the story of Lorenzo and Filippo. On the one hand, it seems like their competition with each other and their sizable egos may have pushed their work into the stratosphere of legend. But at the same time, I can't help but notice a little bit of a logical inconsistency between their beliefs about the artist and genius and the way in which they behaved. If the genius is the perceptive and receptive vessel who imbibes truth from nature and the world around him and distills it into art, in order to be that ideal vessel, would that not necessitate a certain degree of humility and teachability? Or would that just keep them out of the history books? You decide. This video is a little bit different from what I usually do, but I hope you liked it. And if you didn't, I'm sure that the view count will tell that story. But I love art history, and I want to do more of this kind of thing. So if you like this, comment, like, subscribe, hit the little bell, press every button on your screen. Just hit everything. And inevitably, it will bring you back here to me at one point or another. So I'll see you in the next video.